So this week on Totally Classic, I really wanted us to investigate a question that I have seen investigated popularly. So I'd love to figure out our dialogic take on it. The question is JK Rowling transphobic? I think it's a popular accepted, what's the word? It's not a truth so much as a truism. It's a popular truism that J.K. Rowling is transphobic. If you Google or DuckDuckGo, whatever your search engine of choice is, uh, J.K. Rowling transphobic, you will find an abundance of content, or even transphobia. You'll find an abundance of content. But I was struck by two incidents that motivated today's putting forth of this question. In September of last year, I had messaged a friend about a thing they had posted and noted the context on the post that they may not have been aware of. And then secondly, it was like, and this one element is pretty disqualifying, this JK Rowling transphobic thing, because I've never found any evidence. There's no good argument for that as far as I can tell. And the person pretty much responded with one line and was like, peace out, wanting no engagement on that, on any of the points. Now, some people don't use social media to have conversations. I've come to realize I didn't know. I thought social, at least in my life, social always involves conversations. But I'm a talkative person, so that was striking to me that someone would just be like, "This is something that doesn't even warrant discussion." And then earlier this year, I was encouraged. There was a video. If you just search J.K. Rowling critical thinking teacher, you'll find this video of a teacher talking to his student and kind of applying critical thinking skills to this exact claim. In May, that teacher was fired for reasons I don't know, and I wouldn't suggest they are linked, although some headlines have tried to make it so. I found it fascinating. I thought it was heralded as like a master class in critical thinking. It was really just very simple question and answer as to a claim. Until by the end of it, it was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I didn't have evidence to make that claim. It was peaceful. It really wasn't even, it was argumentative in the classic sense, wasn't heated, didn't need to be, especially when we're discussing celebrity opinions or perspectives on or takes on subjects. I don't really think it ever needs to get too animated. And so I thought this would be a somewhat, in some ways, a downgrade from some of our more serious subjects. So, Andy, that's why I'm here. What do you think?
Yes,
Hmm.
I think at best social media is social, and a lot of my life's work is recognizing how extraordinarily dysfunctional the way we communicate through social media often is. And I have a few theories for that, and I know that's not the main topic. Maybe that's another question for another day. Is
Hmm.
social media social? Question mark.
Yeah.
With regard to JK Rowling, I feel like I've sort of just dipped into this a couple of times. I mean, initially I don't know. I think it just sort of drifted by with some distance. I don't scan the interwebs quite as ferociously as you do, but you've brought it back to my attention. And I'm also curious about the timeline. You mentioned the timeline of some of your interactions with other folks. And I was going through this rather extensive Glamour article that sort of cataloged the whole thing.
Yeah, that
But I
was a
didn't actually
Glamour
get to
of
the
all
end.
places.
Glamour. But I didn't actually get to the end. So I'm curious sort of what is the current state of all of this? Because
It's
it
the
seemed to
same.
happen several years ago.
Yeah, I would say it started several years ago. Now, I think this cultural assumption came from very much from Twitter. This is a Twitter born and bred conversation. Um, of course, it exists on all social media platforms now, but initially it was a Twitter-based commentary. It continues to be so, in such that I would say J.K. Rowling uh, is a trending topic on Twitter multiple times a year, um, almost exclusively either directly around her what's the word, around her tweets, her exes, on the
Or
subject.
or trans related tweets.
Her trans related tweets, pretty comprehensively. And even if it's like the new Hogwarts game that did pretty well, Hogwarts Academy or whatever that was called, came out like a year or so ago. Even that was like, should anyone buy this game in light of who JK Rowling has revealed herself to be? It is something that never needed to be that big of a story. She's an enormous author in terms of like her reach and saving the literature for at least 10 years. So I sort of get it. She also is not someone who's interested in like backing down and apologizing when people get mad. So that makes it interesting. But it has been, she has relatively even-handedly maintained the same general position she argued for initially over the years. So in some ways, the continued fervor is based on those who oppose her are continually driving the narrative. And I would say also those, and I would say oppose her because it does go beyond opposing her position. The degree of threats she receives are abundant and consistent. I would not be shocked if it's over tens of thousands of threats against her over the past, whatever, 7 or 8 years since she started talking about it. And also to the degree that it has created what I believe is a cultural belief amongst certain cohorts of the world population at this point, where her transphobia is just assumed. This is one of the things I was talking about when I was responding to Troy Hunter's post. It was sort of a background commentary that wasn't even central to the argument. It was just like, well, and such as that, which we all know about. It kind of had that. We all know this. You know what I mean? It's the sort of thing is like Trump's racist. We all know
Right.
this. And then if you
Just
ask
catch
any,
up. Catch
yeah,
up, man.
yeah, come on, catch up, little tomato, smash. Is that how you? So if you weren't like around for the Twitter conversation of it, is that how you first encountered it? That people just said it as though it was so?
Yeah. I mean, especially since not that I follow them that much anymore, but I mean, I think a lot of the people I follow were, at my poke wokeism. So yeah, I'm probably a bit over indexed on folks who are just going to go all in on the transphobia side of this.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't follow her. Maybe it's worth addressing our personal associations with Harry Potter briefly. I read the first book and I watched the first two movies,
Oh, Andy.
and I found them
And
to be enjoyable. And I am hearing the admonishment in your voice.
oof. Yeah, I think you checked out before they got good. I mean, the second one was decent. The first one was not, I did not think it was good. But I'm just not a Chris Columbus fan.
But they
Although,
got they got the books got so much longer. I just can't.
oh, they got huge. The last one or two or whatever were like flipping weighty tomes. Now I
I'd
grew up
still be
loving,
reading it. I
yeah.
didn't even get through this glamour article. I mean, come on, man.
Oh no. That's so funny. Yeah, I've read all the books. I've seen all the movies. I think they're fine. I'm not like a super fan or anything. I just was like, oh, this is I enjoy obviously based on the show, I enjoy what's going on in culture. I enjoy kind of like knowing what's up with culture. And it was such a phenomenon that I was like, I think I would miss something as to what, at least the culture in the West, but even worldwide, I would be missing something if I missed this cultural piece. It'd be like not seeing Star Wars movies or something.
That's why I read it. Even
Yeah.
just even just one book, which I know is
Yeah.
pathetic, but still versus nothing. I was like, I have to at least understand who the characters are.
Yeah, you
So,
have to have some basis because this is going to come up too often. I
right.
grew up and didn't have a television throughout many years of my life growing up as a kid. And so there are swaths of pop culture that I kind of barely know, like as to my generation. So people will say things and I'll kind of be like, I mean, I've gone in deep enough to kind of like cover those spots. not wanting to feel caught out, like, and not know. This is also sort of my probably hipster mentality, which is like, ooh, you know something I don't know. But darn it. Ooh, cool. What is it? You know, it makes me voracious and want to know the thing. Yes, but it doesn't, but that's the joyful thing to me is like I'm very well aware of her work. I know her story, you know what I mean? Her sort of like sort of rags to riches story. Um, I thought they were when I first read them, I was like, oh, these are hilariously overrated. So it's not like I see her as some venerable author who, you know, whatever changed my perspective on how one could work the medium. I do recognize her importance in terms of literary history because she was they were publishing those, I think, when we were in college. Because I remember we would walk by that outdoor mall in Skokie, Illinois, and I remember that there was like a Barnes and Noble or something there, and I remember walking by after seeing movies at the theater there, and there would be like Harry Potter this Saturday, you know, this Thursday or whatever it was, Thursday at midnight. Harry come and get, and people would line up like those. It was like it was they were literary events breaking through in a time when the internet existed. So it was sort of like, whoa, wait, books can still have impact even though the internet is here. I think that was almost surprising to people that it was like,
Yeah,
and
you're
then
right. I just looked it up. It's 1997 in the UK and 1998 in the US.
yeah. So that was impactful. And I think because I love books. So then to me, I was like, in some ways, I don't listen, if she didn't do it, if Harry Potter didn't do what it did, would books still exist? Yes, of course. But in some ways that was a monumental timing uh for like a massive literary success and getting kids into like that was the thing. It was like, oh my gosh, look at all these kids
Yes,
who were
that's the thing.
and
It
kids hadn't
ignited
been, yeah,
like a whole generation.
yeah, and people thought it was cool too, you know what I mean? Like grown-ups liked it, kids liked it, it was nerdy but it was accessible, and so it was like this. I mean, to compare it to the kids nowadays, it was like a Taylor Swift level of success where it's just like she hits multiple quadrants. And likewise, I think Taylor Swift's music is very capable but unremarkable in many ways. But it just hits all these quadrants. And Harry Potter tells like more of a classic story, meaning like, you know, the reluctant hero, you know, whatever. It's a good versus evil, all this sort of stuff that like we as humans crave and perhaps even need.
Well,
Um,
that is a good comparison in the business sense too, right? You've got
yeah,
women artists who became billionaires based on their art, which is
yeah.
that's
That's
let's face
awesome.
it, that's hard for any artist, you
Oh
know,
my
especially.
gosh, absolutely.
And I think
So
that's one of the things, maybe just because I come from a family of writers, so like the business, my
yeah,
understanding is several publishers turned her down, and finally Scholastic
yeah,
said, I mean, like 30 publishers or something.
it's
So
amazing.
just it's a remarkable story.
Yeah. So I admire, I like have admiration for her as a creative, as a person who's accomplished a lot, and especially as a person who's created something that was well beloved by so many quadrants.
And I,
And
and
I
I
think,
think that piece here feels important.
yeah,
Like I'm, the tweets read like a sense of betrayal,
yeah,
which that's an interesting word to analyze in the context of
it
this.
is.
Um, and if that's true, I think it's because this nestled in so deep.
Yeah,
This feels like ingrained and embedded as part of folks' childhood
yeah, very
or
impactfully.
adulthood or both,
Yeah,
as they've carried on, and especially those who were more or less of similar age, maybe folks a little younger than us,
yeah,
who kind of grew up with these characters
yeah.
around the same age. So I have to believe that is part of what is clearly a very emotional reaction for a lot of folks.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah, I think it is. Well, yeah, because it's uh well, I'm going to compare it to Taylor Swift now that I made the comparison just for the modern comparison of just this like massive cross like multi-quadrant success is um nowadays like look at Taylor. I have a very limited idea of Taylor Swift's opinions on anything, her perspectives on anything. Um and she hasn't I've never heard her express a novel or culturally in terms of the milieu that she exists in personally living as like a whatever a 30 something year old billionaire artist in New York. um anything contrary to her cohort. She's not there to ruffle any feathers at all. She's there to do business or whatever. And that is, I think that's a popular way of being for most artists in our capitalist set. It wasn't always the case, but at some point, not too long ago, it became very uncool or unpopular for very popular people to be interesting or express themselves on an individual basis. Knowing that, and I think some of that came from a cultural push by some cohorts that separating the art from the artist is no longer considered appropriate, and in fact, doing the opposite is what's considered most appropriate. We've seen this with museums adding things, cultural context things about artists, even if it's a painting of a ship and men on a ship, they'll be like, well, but this artist was noted for their, racism and abuse of blah blah blah. You know what I mean? Like, there's all these a certain section, a very highly influential section of our culture has decided that context is maybe even more important, or that who the artist is more important as or more important than their art, which I don't think was popular at all in our generation. I think and maybe it's a cyclical thing. Maybe it was popular at some point in the past from us, but it's a relatively new phenomenon. I would say it's in the last 10 to 15 years that's become, I would say, a dominant amongst a very small group of people. But
Yeah,
people
do you think we've learned more about those artists, or we've focused on different parts of the story? I never went that deep in art history, but it
yeah,
seemed like it was mostly just basic biography stuff. Like, yeah, they were born here, they lived here, they did their art here, and
yeah,
it's intriguing. I mean, even not necessarily going all in on that ideology, certainly their lives and their opinions inform their art. So it's like, well, that's kind of
yeah,
an interesting conversation to have. But maybe the question becomes, should we start canceling artists? Should we cancel a great
yeah,
piece of art because we don't agree with their ideologies?
yeah. Or if they were even heinous, terrible people. Like, I would go see Hitler's paintings in a museum. I don't care. I'll see the paintings, and if I like the paintings, I like the paintings. You know what I mean? Like, David Bowie had sex with like children. Everyone knows that. I still like his music. I think Labyrinth is great. It's like, it's not even I mean, it's certainly interesting, but so much of it feels it almost, I think, well, here's getting weird about it. And it gets us back to celebrity gossip and history. There's a thin They can often be the same thing. So the whole
Hmm.
thing of like all the controversial things that this artist got up to that like are that maybe even were actually non-controversial in his day or their day, then are controversial now. There's really no reason to discuss those. In terms of any sort of brief context, if you want to explore an artist's life, then by all means, then it reaches broader understanding. Um, but again, some of that is, again, I wasn't raised in a culture that did that. That was just like, and I am a creator, in which case, what do you mean? Those things absolutely exist separately. Most critical thought has been developed on that. Like, once a work goes out into the public, it becomes kind of its own thing. So at that point, Harry Potter does, as many people have said, well, you know what? Harry Potter's not hers anymore anyway. It's ours. And they're not wrong. They're not. I mean, it is hers as well in a very concrete sense. But it does also belong to all of those who have lived in it and thrived in it. You know what I mean? That's the beauty. That is the majesty of art. So I actually think she's a rare person to just speak up from the position of like artistic influence, to just be like, oh yeah, I think differently, and I'm not concerned with how some curator is going to portray my legacy. That they're like, she got cut. There was like a Harry Potter movie reunion special on HBO a couple of years ago, and she was not in it. They interviewed everybody kind of except for her. They included, I think, 2 bites from her, 3 bites from her from when they were filming the movie, but they cut her out of it. So like, her legacy is already being kind of written
Yeah.
into a particular fashion. And I have zero doubt that at some point there's going to be an exhibit of like Harry Potter related things at a major museum or whatever. It's going to talk through the history of the cultural thing, and there will be a disclaimer. There will be a disclaimer on a placard somewhere in that museum, which I think is ethically heinous. That someone's like, "Whoa, she was she was considered, well, there would be like, maybe triggering for some, but we think, there's going to be an apology letter. Now, maybe by the time such an exhibit happens, and maybe it's already happened, then our culture will have moved on from this. Um, but in many ways, I find her tweets more brave than anything she's ever accomplished. Because especially for the heat she's taken from it, and that it's literally had people divorcing her from her own creation. It's had people, especially the movie people, Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, or whatever, came out and were just like we don't stand with her, and that
Yeah.
and I was just like, what? So people publicly distancing themselves from you based on nothing. I've never seen any evidence of her being transphobic.
Well, we,
Um,
we should get into what she said, but
yeah,
I agree with what you just said. What without directly saying whether or not I agree with her,
yeah,
I absolutely agree that that is an act of courage to say what you believe
yeah,
with that huge of an audience, with knowing that it's going to have an impact and influence, probably a lot of backlash. She knows that.
yeah.
Uh, and as we've addressed probably many times, somebody who tends to play it more safe. I think you're out there, you know, poking and sharing truth and asking good questions more than I am. So I agree with you. I think that is an act of courage.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, one of the key things is, and that we may have a disagreement on that, so that's why I thought we should start with this because it's gentle, is is transphobia? Meaning we still live in an English world where the word blank phobia means a disproportionate or undue fear of whatever comes before phobia. That's what the suffix means. So coulrophobia means I think if I'm remembering correctly, is an undue or disproportionate fear of clowns. That's still and there's a hydrophobia, agoraphobia, whatever. All those things still mean a disproportionate fear of blank. We also concurrently in our culture have people, again, this is like in clinical and non-clinical use of terms. But phobias have been around and people have talked about phobias for, I don't even know, hundreds of years, right? Even just popularly on the street. So how exists things like homophobia and transphobia, Islamophobia, which is used in a completely different fashion. And I can't tell whether people are using it just like poorly, incorrectly, or if there's now again, the ways we talked about with the sort of like novelization and where the newest thing is the dominant thing, where now it can just mean like a disapproval for, a non-support of, etc. So then, like, there's two different standards that we can almost discuss this discussion. Meaning, like, is she disproportionately afraid of trans-identifying persons? Which I would say, seemingly, absolutely not. There's no evidence for that. Is she?
In fact,
Uh,
there's evidence to the contrary. She claims to have
yeah,
trans friends.
yeah, that she's just like, what? Oh, I'm not. I was just like, what are you talking about? So, and then secondly, people use things like homophobia or whatever just to mean anything that is, let's say, critical of any ideology around trans identification or homosexual identification or whatever. So, meaning it's divorced from concurrent use, precedent and concurrent use while we're still using it that way. And I find so I generally, I probably haven't talked to this before, that things like homophobia used in the pop sense completely inappropriate. People are like, oh, you know what I mean? And I was like, I know what you mean, but then I also know what you're doing, which is saying someone has a disproportionate fear of gay people if they, for example, think that gay people shouldn't get married. You're like, that doesn't those don't correlate. That's not those aren't a direct proof. Now, if
Yeah,
you every time you saw a gay couple holding hands, you clutched your purse and ran across the street screaming, that would be homophobic. You are disproportionately afraid of gay people. And that is a problem. I would say that would be a problem psychologically for you. I mean, gosh, especially during June. You just got to shut all the television off. Um, so
yeah,
that's my first inquiry.
it's a worthwhile distinction, and because those people certainly exist, I think,
Yeah,
that are actually phobic and
yeah,
like just can't like their mind melts if they, yeah, see gay or trans people. And I think you're right. That is not actually what people are addressing here. I agree with the framings that you just offered. And another one, though, I think is
Mm.
like perceiving someone to be heaping on
Mhm.
to the mainstream narratives that people are fighting against.
Yeah,
So I think that's a key element where
yeah,
it's not just this individual thing, but it's like, hey, we're this minority group, we're oppressed, we're fighting against something.
yeah,
And if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not with us, which is something we talk all the time about, like what does with us mean?
yeah.
Then you are part of what we're fighting against, and you're an impediment to our progress.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. Well, to me, which then would be fuel for it's an intentional misuse of the word phobia, meaning it's like it's castigating someone as you can't you couldn't be rejecting us on any rational basis. It has to be irrational. It has to be a clinical diagnosis of you're so afraid, which is hilarious. It's basically like it's the cliche of like how like teenage boys try to get girls to have sex with them. It's like, oh, don't be afraid. Oh, you're just afraid. Oh, you're just afraid of sex. It's fine. Reminds me of the opening of Kids. Um, it's rapey. Oh, you don't like this? Yeah, you're just afraid. Like you're not mature enough. Like it's so potently and obviously manipulative to think that way, you know? So I think, yeah, but I would agree with you that I don't think the accusation, well, some people do make the accusation out loud, but generally the accusation is not that she is disproportionately afraid of trans people.
I would also assume most folks who use that term haven't thought about it in much depth. I honestly, I didn't think much about people throwing around terms like that. I think before we started talking about it and analyzing the real meaning of it, it was like, I didn't necessarily believe that everybody was anti-trans. That's the
Yeah,
translation I'm, oh,
yeah, yeah.
oh, what they're
Which,
saying is anti-trans. Is that true?
yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
and even those are huge claims because then you're like, what is that? I mean, it's just, yeah, it's vague. And listen, I love specificity in language, which is probably why I say too many words. Um, but even that, yeah, I think that's really what they're meaning to accuse. And so it's like, why don't you just do that? Because that exists. And then we can argue that too. Because then you're like, well, what do you mean? Are you anti-trans, meaning trans, like the ideology that trans identifying people are accurately understanding their reality, which is one thing. Or are you anti-trans, meaning anti-trans people, meaning a person who is a trans identifying person, you're anti that person. Because those things can both exist in the same language. And then so it gets super confusing. I mean, I say this because I've had so many arguments with people about these sort of things, and then I spend all the time arguing anti-trans. Well, no, you can literally be like, all trans people, trans identity people are clinically, mentally ill, and that's not anti-trans. That doesn't have to be anti-trans if anti-trans means trans-identifying persons. It's not anti-schizo. It's not anti-schizos to say, oh, this person is a schizophrenic. They are mentally ill and they need to be treated as though they're mentally ill. Not opposed to that person. It's actually the most loving thing I could say. Or anorexics or whatever. Like anything that causes someone to perceive the world differently than how other people perceive the world, essentially. But yes, but I do agree that I think that is generally what people mean. Although it'd be interesting to represent it as a mainstream narrative, because I would say the mainstream narrative, meaning the loudest narrative in our culture, is trans accepting, meaning the majority of news outlets will just use whatever pronoun a person wants. They will call someone who identifies as a woman a woman. I actually think it makes reading the news kind of difficult. I have to imagine for like boomers and older that reading the news has become very confusing sometimes. Um, so in some ways it's not, she is actually up, it's she's ideating in opposition to the mainstream. So that's what's fascinating to me too about like how people have come down on her. They're like, why don't you get on board with what the loudest voices in our culture are saying? Basically, you Luddite, you backwards person, come catch up to us in the present, in the present and towards the future. but do you perceive the mainstream narrative differently?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think we've talked about this in other episodes. No, I mean the narrative I hear from trans activists is very much like still one of oppression and non-acceptance.
Yeah, where I don't see evidence of that. I've never, I don't see it. I mean, literally every news outlet that reports on, like, let's say they like banned surgeries and hormones or whatever, they still refer to that as gender affirming. They're banning gender affirming surgeries. So that means, by perspective, by bias, 90% of the news outlets who write about it, every mainstream one outside of maybe like a Fox News or an OAN or whatever, are on their side. So yeah, I think I just I don't see it. And especially again, one of the things we first started talking about was like discrimination against the unvaccinated, um, which is much more open. Like it's literally like, no, if you're unvaccinated, you can't come in. So it's like if you're trans identifying, you can't walk in here. Then we can start being like, oh, you're oppressed because we have like explicit evidence. So instead we have subtle claims of, like some people are saying that like kids can't. I mean, what? So I'm sure activists could say that, but then I'm like, I don't. Again, I don't see any evidence for that either. So then I'm baffled. I'm baffled how something that pretty much every major corporation like bows to and it's like, yep, we're on board. I don't know any corporate entities who've made all sorts of public statements about all sorts of social issues for years have ever come out and been like, this trans thing is out of control. So then every major corporation is on your side. Almost every major news network is on your side. It's hard to see how that's in what way are you oppressed in any sort of mainstream sense. It would seem false. It would seem like a lie.
I think one thing that comes to me is, because I worked with a trans woman for
Yeah.
a year and we traveled together, and that was eye-opening. And
Yeah.
one of my perceptions is that it was challenging to walk through public. You get a lot of stares, and I don't know. I don't believe she's doing this for attention. Maybe some people are. Who knows? But
Yeah. I don't know.
and I think that could actually bring us back a little more squarely to this conversation with JK Rowling, because um, there was one of the tweets that I think got to this, and I didn't even click into it. I assume it was a trans person who was just saying basically it ended in leave us alone. And
Yeah.
I remember, I think when we did a more specific, even more specific trans episode several months ago, that was sort of where I landed. It was like, why don't I'm just kind of like, why do we even talk about it this much? So either there's very, very real
Yeah.
oppression and violence happening, which I think in the consistent frame you and I both hold of harm reduction, that would be worth exploring and understanding and changing.
Yeah.
Or there's just a lot of extra attention happening here that
Yeah.
nobody seems to want, or maybe they do. I don't know.
Yeah. I
And
don't know who wants it. Somebody wants it because they're doing it and changing law. That's why JK Rowling started talking about it. She started talking because there were laws being changed and there were people being fired. So her original response, hers was her initial entree into the world was in response, in response to no anti-liberalism, essentially. Where no, we're not going to just live and everyone can kind of do their own thing. So she responded to what is authoritarianism, ideological authoritarianism, which I would say I don't know anybody who's responding to anything else. Meaning, like once other than kids, when it comes to kids, once kids got involved and kids started transitioning, people got pretty freaky deaky, and I feel like that's the same with mass shootings. When 6 people get shot in a single incident in, let's say, Chicago, right? But let's say Shreveport. Um, no one, people are like, oh, that's awful. But then, like when a school shooting happens, people are like, "What is happening? We cannot have these guns around any." And so, likewise, once you involve kids in anything, people get pretty adamant. But that's the
Well, I think,
fascinating thing to me is like most, again, here's a person responding to being imposed upon. Therefore, it's a form of oppression to be able to fire someone for their views. And that's what she was originally responding to, was I think a woman journalist of some sort. And then the people who then are oppressing you say that they're oppressed. Subjectively, at the very least, it's hard to, it's not acceptable. Now, objectively, you could argue for a larger, a larger schematic in which, you're responding or whatnot. But it's wild to me. Just again, I don't exist in spaces where people are just like, trans people are gross, get away. Which would be this sort of assumed thing. Now, I'm sure some people, trans people, deal with that the same way as I have been treated as such when I dress certain ways. And I remember when I was in Portland, Portland people were phenomenally rude folks on the street. Rudest city I've ever been in. And I've been if you are different than whatever else is going on, people are going to say shit. People are going to talk shit. That's pretty much always going to happen.
well, and
Which
one
is
of the
which is fine.
challenges is somebody looking at you doesn't mean that they're cruel or have ill intent.
No,
And I
you're just
relate that to that too. Some
yeah,
people look
yeah,
at me, and I tend to project like
yes,
a sense of like don't look at me, like I don't want your attention.
yeah, yeah,
But I'm a people watcher too. I love looking at people,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and I'm just genuinely curious. Like, oh wow, wonder why they made that choice today.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Well, especially if you're doing something that defies social norms, cultural norms, biological norms, whatever. Like if you're, anyone who does plastic surgery, I stare. I think it's fascinating. And that's probably a good example because they're defying like biological norms. They're doing all this weird ish to their face. And when I lived in LA, I was staring much more often. But I was like, you can't be surprised when people are staring at you when you do some different stuff, right? When I dress like an Indian dude in a thing that looks like a dress, I'm not surprised when people are looking at me. I wear it because I think it looks cool. People look at me weird. That's just
And
that's
so
so
looking
then
is one thing, and we
yeah,
never really know. I did hear one horrible story once where somebody put a cigarette out on a trans friend, so
yeah,
that's clearly there are at least anecdotal stories of violence happening.
yeah,
Um, I I happen to find this article again, and there's just a couple of tweets it references that
yeah,
I mean one is related to the earlier framing, which I thought was worth mentioning. Mallory Rubin, Harry Potter is about the magic of love, acceptance, belonging, the power of courage, the impact of hope. Trying to take those things away from people is a terrible tragedy. Trans women are women. So just this piece about the framing, trying to take that away.
yeah. It's
So
interesting, right?
for the author to be saying something.
Yeah,
Um, and
but
then
it's
the one
it,
I
but
was referencing,
yeah,
oh, go
yeah.
ahead. You want to
No,
talk
I'm just
about
saying in Harry Potter does a good job of world building and the rules of the world. Meaning, a Muggle can be accepted, but a Muggle is not a magical person, and a
it?
magical
Right.
person is never a Muggle. So then it's a very particular reading of Harry Potter to just be like, anyone can be anything they want. You're like, well, no, no, magical people can be magical, like a full-on Muggle. Now, Muggle can occasionally like interbreed with wizards or whatever and have like partially like Muggle kids or magical kids, but it's not like you can that those lines of division always existed in the novel as well. So
Yeah.
then she's not making any claims outside of it. Hold on just one second. But yeah,
Yeah.
so
And
go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
well, here's the second one. This is the one I was referencing from Paris Lees. There's just no evidence that me being me is causing problems for any of the other women I've met. If there are ever any problems between women and trans women, they should be dealt with sensitively and sensibly on a case-by-case basis. Please, for the love of God, leave us alone.
Yeah, that's not but listen, this might not be that trans person's cause, but it's not that's off the table. That's not on the table anymore. It's if there are trans activists and they have been effective, right? Because it's something everyone's been talking about. There's no leave you, there's no alone. There's no leave you alone. And there's no leave you alone in her initial say, like it's an unfair argument because in her initial thing, she's responding to people not being left alone. So then it's this is what I and this is listen, I've run through thousands of comments on off of her tweets or whatever. And I was like, occasionally there's some arguments that I was like, oh yeah, I got a little point there. But like these popular arguments, they're not that's not tenable. What do you mean leave? If it was really just like live and let live, leave me alone. First of all, JK Rowling's done nothing to that person on an individual basis. So they've even violated their own premise, right? Where they said these things should be dealt with like on an individual basis. But this person is tweeting a public figure with whom she has no interaction, or he or she has no interaction. So that argument is literally crumbles under its own premise. And that's what I see so consistently. So again, this is why I think people call her transphobic, is because no one's been able to respond to her rationally, like in any sense that isn't self-defeating or what have you.
And so
And
to
again,
trace it, I think to the root,
yeah,
I think she was responding to a comment where somebody else said people who menstruate. And
yeah,
this was actually related to COVID-19, right? Creating a more equal post-COVID-19 world for people who menstruate. And then she,
yeah,
somewhat cheekily says, "Oh, I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out." And then she goes a bit in some subsequent tweets. If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. But this is the one that struck me because what I'm most interested in here is the extent to which this whole conversation um, diminishes the lived experience of women and the very real oppression of women. So this one, then she goes on to say the idea that women like me who've been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences is a nonsense. Anyway, and then it goes on.
nonsense. Yeah,
But this idea that her life, I think what she's largely defending
yeah,
is her lived experiences as a woman, a biological woman in every way. Um, that yeah, so that's probably the most intriguing question for me, right?
yeah, yeah,
Is this a zero-sum game between trans people and women in the terms of the harm they've received and continue to receive and the ability to even share their narrative?
yeah,
Is some of
and
that being taken away? It seems to
yeah,
be her point.
and it's hard not to see individual on an individual basis trans identifying men as continual oppressors of women, right? Because we now have multiple examples of men in women prisons like raping women. We have multiple examples across multiple countries. And so, and that's systemic, right? Because that would be a policy slash law change based on advocacy and based on everyone just gets to be what they want, which is almost like anti-liberalism, ultra-liberalism. And then, so it does have consequences, literal consequences that we've all seen and we all know about, and no one is in denial of. I don't think. Um, but it's also, I think it's based on subjective experience, but also objective reality, because then it says like sex is real. So sex is real, and gender and sex are synonymous usage. As an author, she would know that. As a writer, as a cultural appreciator, she would know the usages of those terms and that it's a novel proposition. And then also and then I feel vibe off this as well. As an artist, creator, imaginer, it diminishes even her work in fiction to make fiction reality. So then if that which I simply subjectively kind of believe or can imagine about myself is what is real, then that makes play more like imagination play as real as reality. Now, of course, in some ways it is, but is it in terms of for other people and in any sort of um, congressional human fashion? Well, no, of course not. And it diminishes the spirit of fun and imagination and play because it makes it all the same. And you're like, well, no, it's not. That's the joy of fantasy, is actually going outside of reality. And then you can learn a ton there, but it is still separate. Like it is a separate section of of um of again of mutual congress one to another. So you can imagine that you could use hot air balloons to hold a bridge up, and that's a super cool idea. And we can draw it and think of it and have AI render it in 14 seconds for us. But if you did it, most often people would drive over the bridge and die, probably most of the time. So we do still live in a world where like the fantasy thing is a super cool thing and you can learn. And maybe over time, someone can eventually develop, because of that imagination, develop a system that actually functions as such. But I think as a fiction writer, or a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, then that also becomes, I think, fundamental to her part of the worldview that she's expressing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
again, yeah, and again, nothing there is transphobic. Nothing there is, again, disproportionately fear or hateful of a person simply because they're trans, right? Like one, you can hate a black person and not be racist. If you hate them because they're black, then you're racist. You can hate a white person because they're white and you're racist. If you hate a white person because of something else, you're a hateful person. That's something you should probably have to wrangle with. But
In fact,
it
if you
doesn't, it
hate them
doesn't,
and pretend that you don't hate them because they're black,
yeah,
that's that's arguably racist.
yeah, that's racist. So likewise with trans, like, right, you can be like, I don't hate you as a person. And maybe sometimes I feel like I've watched her interactions with people, and that's one of her refusals, is to like, I'm not going into the world of like anti-trans or transphobia means hate of or opposition to ideologies or ways of dealing with whatever this dilemma is. Instead, she's like, I'm not, I don't hate people just because they're trans. So no, that's simply not true.
I'm
And then
just
anti a person because they're trans. And again, you can actively resist people and argue against them on a daily basis. We've seen this throughout history, that people who would argue for a living on television, or Sam Harrison, Jordan Peterson, or whatever, Buckley, or you know what I mean, all that sort of stuff. We've seen that throughout history. Like people argue and disagree with each other all day long, and none of that's hateful. You can actively oppose people, and it's not hateful. So it's not de facto hateful to simply like even advocate like against an entire, a counter activist set. Doesn't mean you hate those people. It just mean be like, oh, they're wrong, and all I want to do is to help them. So I think in some ways, some of that's my thesis, is some of the assumption of her transphobia is based on this. If you don't agree with me, you hate me premise,
yeah,
which is
part of the
false.
worry. I mean, Daniel Radcliffe, um, aka Harry Potter
Yeah.
himself, came out against her, so to speak, and mentioned the Trevor Project. So there's this one quote: 78% of transgender and non-binary youth reported being the subject of discrimination due to their gender identity. It's clear that we need to do more to support transgender and non-binary people. Thank you, Daniel Radcliffe, for all your support. I wonder if part of there's like an extra layer of concern here because these are fundamentally children's books. And
Yeah.
the concern is, oh, we need to protect the youth. And this is going
Yeah.
to,
I think that's what everyone's arguing about. Yeah. Well, I think I mean, especially when it comes to kids and certain gender surgeries or drugs, both sides of the argument are making the argument of protecting children.
right.
Like no one's like, oh, let's get these kids. They're like, so it's kid protection continues throughout and that's part of Rowling's purview as well, which is like, again, if a man identifies as a woman, does that mean we treat them as a woman, statistically, socioeconomically, culturally, in terms of taking care of children, for example, because men are much more likely to sexually abuse children. it sucks. I've worked with kids. You have to go through a background screening all the time. That's great. It should be that way. But the statistical reality very consistently is that men harm period more often than women. And there's no set of evidence that says because you're a man who says you're a woman that you're less like that somehow you have that statistical likelihood removed from you simply because you claim it to be so. So then again, this is when you start just altering categories. Again, it's a fundamental, it's not a minor thing. It's not just like you're actually proposing a fundamental reorientation of all society. How we viewed all data in terms of protection from harm or that sort of thing. And again, I can argue that. And again, if I meet a trans person, hugging on them, loving them, dancing with them, having a good time, listening to them, shoulder to cry on, whatever, I'm gonna love the hell out of whoever I meet.
Well, that's fascinating because there's certainly pushback on like, you think because I'm a trans person or trans woman, especially, I would think that I'm more likely to engage in harm.
Yeah.
And I think that
which
the reality is what you're saying, which, being a man, I never loved hearing that statistical reality that men are people, and yet I have to accept it because it's a statistical reality. And I guess the best we can do is be one of the good guys and stand up for good and all that.
Yeah, don't add to those stats. Yeah.
But it's not so much that a trans woman is more likely.
They're more likely than a woman. Yeah. True.
Well, no, I mean, not by virtue of being trans or of transitioning.
Well, yeah, no, we don't have any evidence for that either. Yeah.
Because they're a man.
Yes.
Who has transitioned. And that whatever it is about men that makes us more violent or more likely to cause harm, I don't think evaporates somebody transitions.
It would. We just have no evidence that it would. So it's magical thinking until we can prove some sort of statistical correlation or whatever.
Something does shift though. I have a friend who's a trans man, and it's really fascinating. Again, just anecdotally talking to folks, hearing stories, because he was saying that when he transitioned, he suddenly felt like access to all of this power of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
That, so I mean, I love that quality of it. I mean, not only like you just said, like love on anybody I meet, but to the extent you and I love analyzing sort of our world through all these different lenses, it's like, wow, who better to kind of understand stepping through worlds than somebody who's lived in both of them.
But they haven't, unless they, you know what I'm saying? Like, because I've been on mushrooms and I understand transcendental realities and then have access to the universe. And I was like, I can change material reality with my words. And then I don't. So when you give yourself, now this is but what this does reflect potently is one has access to all the power you want anytime you want. Because if all you have to do is say you're something else, and then you all of a sudden feel access, then that access was never denied you. So as a woman, she was never denied anything. If she can inherit it by ultimately just believing in herself and then claiming out loud in some fashion to be a thing, then she has that power. So then any black man, if they want to, can just be like, I'm going to transition and be a white man now. And I have all the power a white man has. In which case, where does that lead us culturally? You're like, okay, well, I mean, in some ways, it's the most bootstraps ideology possible, which is like all you have to do is change what you call yourself, and then you have access to all of that. So unless it may be true, it sounds like fantasy, but it could be reality.
Well, it makes me think of you as an actor, even.
Yeah, and that's why I love acting.
Yeah,
it's amazing. You get to inhabit, and again, this is probably one of the reasons why I'm more like, I don't think a trans identity is a legitimate one in any objective sense. It's just like being like Daniel Day-Lewis. Cool, you're like full on committed. Daniel Day-Lewis is not Abraham Lincoln, but is he full on Abraham Lincoln, and everyone's going to treat him as such and not dead name him during the production? Absolutely. But to me, that's one of the things that makes art special, is that you go away and you return and you learn the lessons and you bring them back home. It's not a hero's journey if you don't return home. So if you don't for example, you don't detransition, then you've not completed the hero's journey. You're still lost. You've left yourself, right? You've left yourself and gone into outer reaches. But if you don't return home with the lessons learned, this is just classic, whatever, like Western Greek, informed story arc. You don't return home or return to where you began with that which transforms everything around you, then you haven't completed your journey. Now, some people could say as a trans person, I left my hometown, went and lived as this other person, came back as this person and transformed. Maybe you can kind of complete the hero's journey in that fashion. You can kind of, there's arguments to be made. But it's fascinating when you consider all the things that it alters. And again, I'm trying to think of it from JK Rowling's perspective too, as like a writer, and knowing that like that classic story arc is kind of built into all the books. That like you go on this adventure, you have to unravel all these mysteries in order to accrue the knowledge that helps you win in the end. Like whatever, defeat the serpent or whichever Horcrux is opened this time.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
my sense in talking to trans friends is it was like they never felt like themselves in that hometown. They weren't in the right skin, and then
yeah,
now they are.
But they're in the same skin is the funny thing. Like no one's really, I mean, this is sometimes why I think all the legislation is a little weird. I was like, you're not changing that much. Really. You're not changing. You're making cosmetic changes. That's it. You're making cosmetic changes and some hormonal changes, and you're taking drugs and having surgeries. So it's just like, in some ways you're almost like, again, this is why for adults, you're just like, why are we involved in this? This is just, I don't know, whatever. People want to do stuff to themselves. I walk through Beverly Hills and people have done weird stuff to themselves all over the place. And I think it's terrible. So I guess that's the thing. People are just like, they see it and they see people wounding themselves. Like on every Beverly Hills corner, you're like, oh, this person, what sort of self-loathing do you have to do to Michael Jackson your face like that? And we don't have any cultural examples of people doing it healthily, really, And so you're like, it's just, I think from the outside, you're just like observing that same thing, which is someone can't be themselves. And so they're going to be something else instead. And that, I think, culture, again, this is also a Harry Potter thing. Like Harry Potter is who Harry Potter is. And he tries to say, well, I'm not that. Like, I grew up, I'm not magical, and then his thing is often sort of rejecting or trying to some ways, if he can get away from his destiny, to be the one who can defeat the evil. And it just says, well, but no, this is real. Like, you don't decide, Harry. Like, you don't get to decide what your life is. So in some ways, I think it's fascinating that then people would be like, Harry Potter's about becoming whatever you want. You're like, nah, not really. No, it's like he's stuck on the course from the first book. And this is like exactly what he's going to do.
And I had the thing in his forehead.
Yeah, it was like he was smart. The boy who lived. The boy who lived. But back to JK, like, do we, again, since I said the glamour thing, which is actually a pretty good summary, like cursory summary, without going deep into her replies. Do you know anybody who has made any mention, ever even in passing, of her being transphobic, or maybe even just said it out loud, that has ever supplied evidence that she is transphobic?
Yeah, this is pretty far out of orbit for me. I don't think of any friend who's mentioned it.
Oh,
maybe when it was first happening, maybe especially because that was, the summer of George Floyd and all that. And most of us were sitting around with nothing better to do.
Yeah,
maybe probably saw some things flying through, but it's been a long time. Yeah. And no, I don't. That's why I'm like actually trying to catch up and see what was said and read some of these tweets, because I'm like, I don't.
Yeah, I think one thing she's done a good job actually is being actually very thorough in her argument. And she's even written long pieces and stuff in order to be like, here's what it is. And it's funny too, if you look at I think one of the things that you read one of the responses to her said, "There's just no evidence that me being me is causing problems." Especially in 2020. What a fascinating retort, right? Because then when people are like, all people are all white people are racist or whatever like that, or there's systemic oppression, and white people are behind it. Then if a white person says, there's just no evidence that me being me is causing any problems for anyone. And how would that benefit? So to me, having these arguments in the midst of 2020 is actually the perfect time to have them. Because then you're like, well, wait a second. That wouldn't be an acceptable argument on any other basis. So why is it acceptable, or by the same cohort who would be arguing, who thinks JK Rowling's transphobic, wouldn't be like, oh, well, your individual actions or your lack of blame or whatever is not relevant to what's going on in any broadly cultural sense or systemic sense. So then again, it's a losing argument from the cohort who most often argues against JK Rowling. But if you see it as somewhat legitimate, which is also fine, then you also have to accept the legitimacy of argument for any other basis, where someone's like, well, I'm not individually a racist. So then what is me? I should just be able to be me however I want to be me. And it's not causing harm for anyone to just be me however I'm being me. And you're like, so that it flies in the face of any sort of systemic responsibility as a thesis for human beings. So that's sort of I mean, that to me this is what's so fascinating about it in general is not only what she's putting forth and why she's doing it and the context in which she's doing it, but then the people who come to like refute her. To me, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I just keep wondering why she chose this hill to die on.
Yeah, it's just I think as a woman, I think for those reasons, as a woman, womanhood exists. Once you start calling women like people who menstruate, or calling a vagina a front hole, which has happened in like medical terminology, as a woman, I'd be flipping pissed. I'd be like, what? Hey, back off. Especially, and then if dudes get to somehow like if their whole, especially for 30 years of Smash the Patriarchy, if then the patriarchy can say they're not a patriarch anymore, and then they get to beat you in sports or rape you in prison or have you fired from your job because you are like, but you're the patriarch, you're a man. Then, I mean, as a feminist, like any baseline feminist would be pretty irritated. I think as she might have a lot, she based on the things she argues about, she seems especially protective of lesbians as well. And lesbians in general, like I think have a greater preponderance of turf being accused of being turfs than the average cohort. And then again, as a creative person, that if imagination is real, like if Harry Potter is real, then it's not the same thing as here is this amazing story you can imagine to be inspired by. It makes her work. It makes her work of writing fiction an entirely different operation that she may not agree with, sort of thing. And then I just was watching people personally being oppressed or victimized, meaning they were fired or whatever, or the new hate speech laws in various UK, and they're I think it's up for vote in Ireland, where it went from being something that like live and let live to no, you actually have to do it this way or you'll be accused of hate speech. In which case, again, this is the leave me alone thing ship sailed. I don't even know how long ago. Probably 5 to 10 years ago. Like that just doesn't exist anymore because laws. It is political because laws are being made.
Well, this whole thing does seem to fall into the category that you and I are so often attracted to, which is just what happens when somebody says something off script that's perceived to be off script.
Yeah.
I want to roll back the tape even further. Like, I don't know what the hell was Rowling saying before all this. What did we think of her? Did people just imagine who she was based on how they felt about Potter?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know anything about her politics or much of anything, to be honest. So that's a curiosity.
No.
And then, the minute she said something that was perceived to be off script, the shit's canceling.
Yeah.
The threats. I mean, it's more than canceling. I mean, it's multiple actual life threats, rape, etc.
Yeah. Oh, quite often. Yeah. Well, and in some ways, it sort of she's an excellent case study for a cultural assumption of who she is because of what she said, which then shows that she's not the oppressor. She's like she's being like she's putting out glamour. Something as banal as Glamour magazine is kind of like here's her controversial transphobic comments or whatever kind of thing. You're like, okay, well, so then again, she's counter the mainstream. I don't know how something can be wholly mainstream and and oppressed at the same time. That seems unlikely. I was like, I don't know if that, again, subjectively it may feel that way, but I was like, I don't know that it can. And again, this is one of the great things. One of the things was so good about like 2020, 2021, 2022 is we saw what like open discrimination looks like, where people just started being like, you can't come in here unless you're this. So now we have actually a pretty good standard of like, okay, how hardcore our society does it. And we didn't have that as people. I've never seen a thing outside of thing being like, if you are a man dressed as a woman, you can't come in here. Never seen that. Never seen that. If you're black, you can't come in here. You're white, you can't come in here. Never seen that. So now I knew those things existed, and they have existed in the past. I didn't live through any of them. So again, I have an objective experience knowing that people have been discriminated on various bases explicitly, like in a way that we all can know about. But then it happened now for our generation. We can see what explicit like discrimination looks like, and that we as a society actually strangely have had very little problem with it. So then I was like, it's so helpful. It put in perspective all these other claims as to oppression in a current sense, you know? And there are going to be downstream consequences of past oppression, downstream occurrences based on present oppression, all that sort of stuff still exists. But I think that's been helpful. This, again, especially JK Rowling thing, is like, yeah, she spoke out of turn for what the mainstream narrative is, what the dominant narrative is.
So it's like a follow-up question for me is it possible to support trans folks without canceling JK Rowling? And there was something I meant to say earlier when we were talking about separating the art from the artist.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's something around just the idea of like psychological shadow and projection, which I think informs a lot of these. It's a little murkier to sort of point to objective truth, but I think, governs a lot of these pylons, right? And
Yeah.
the idea of one way we could say it is, oh, we're starting to understand the history or the shadow of the artists more, or their lived experience.
Yeah.
Or maybe we knew it and maybe we're just talking about it more. To your point, it's like now it's the like placard in the museum.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like we all have shadows. We all have demons. We all have however you want to label that. And so is this really just what happens at scale, right? I mean, obviously, JK Rowling, incredibly prominent, influential,
Yeah. Yeah.
read figure. Yeah, is that just the price of being out there and speaking your mind in that way?
Yeah. It certainly is in terms of the reaction. It's not the price in terms of the labeling, meaning like a false price or like a false declaration is never a due price for activity, words, etc. Like a false accusation. You're like, yes, it could be an expected one, but it's never an appropriate one. Meaning, is she revealing her shadow or is she revealing other people's shadow by shining her light? Is the constant question, you know? And it exists somewhere it may exist somewhere in the middle or an incident by incident basis. But in some ways, Andy, for this conversation, and it's kind of exciting how novel it is for you, and sort of I don't know, in some ways surprising to me, just because like I've seen her transphobia mentioned on people's, again, the mutual friend of ours stories, or I've seen it but I'm also on Twitter more too. So, but even on Instagram or whatever, I've seen it in news articles and headlines and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I probably in the past 4 years, I've probably seen 60, 70 like non sought out mentions of it. So in some ways, it's fascinating and cool that you've not encountered it or no one's even made a joke about it around you or I've heard people talk about it in public at other tables at restaurants, and so it's
Maybe I've
something
just ignored it in some way. I don't know.
yeah.
Um,
Or if you're not a Harry Potter fan, maybe her name doesn't do the same.
it doesn't hold as much weight. That's
Yeah, it
true.
doesn't tickle the same fancy, you know?
Well, and your question was, had I seen anybody post evidence of her transphobia? And to that,
Yes,
I
yes.
would simply say no,
No. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in the strict sense that we're talking about of the
Yeah.
word. Um, have I seen mentions in passing? I must have. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm as addicted to my Facebook feed as anybody, but
That's what it's meant for, man. That's what it's created to do. You can't blame heroin for getting you hooked.
just playing my part.
Yeah, baby.
All
Uh,
right.
so I'm gonna go. I mean, I even from the get-go, I was a no. Uh no, I've seen no evidence of her to be transphobic, so then I can't claim her to be transphobic by either the strict definition for certain and then even the ancillary definition of anti. Um, so I'm gonna do a thumbs down.
Yeah, certainly a thumbs down in the strict definition of being, viscerally and nervous systemy
Yeah,
agitated
yes,
by trans
yes,
folks.
yeah, somatic.
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I don't. I mean, I'm really just trying to go based on what she seems to have said in her tweets,
Yeah,
which do not read as anti-trans to me. The fact that they are are being interpreted to go against the narrative, the pro-trans movement sort of script, and given her influence, I can see why an argument to be anti-trans could be constructed. But it feels like a stretch for me.
yeah, like a downstream consequence sort of idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, all right. So Harry Potter 3, I'm telling you, they just get better. The movies, anyway. They're
Put
not
that,
as long as the books.
put that somewhere on the list.
Right on.
You know
Well,
what?
thanks.
Or I could
Yeah.
I could get an easy woke card here by just being like, oh, I canceled her before anybody. And
Yeah,
y'all are so
exactly.
late to the party.
Yeah. By the third movie, man, I was by Azkaban, I was done or whatever. Was it Azkaban? I don't remember. Anyway, I think Azkaban was third. Ah, gosh, it's weird that I know that. Andy, thanks for talking to me about this.
Thank you. Love you.
I love you. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Bye.